Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sophia, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Suleika Jaouad's debut novel, Between Two Kingdoms, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Suleika Jaouad for the launch of Suleika's debut book, Between Two Kingdoms. Suleika Jaouad is an Emmy Award-winning writer, speaker, cancer survivor, and activist. She served on Barack Obama's President's Cancer Panel, and her advocacy work, reporting, and speaking has been featured at the United Nations, on Capitol Hill, and on the TED Talk main stage. When she's not on the road with her 1972 Volkswagen camper van and her rescue dog, Oscar, she lives in Brooklyn. Joining Suleika in conversation is Tara Westover. Tara Westover was born in Idaho in 1986. She received her BA from Brigham Young University in 2008 and was subsequently awarded a Gates Cambridge Scholarship. She earned an MPhil from Trinity College, Cambridge in 2009, and in 2010 was a visiting fellow at Harvard University. She returned to Cambridge, where she was awarded a PhD in history in 2014. Her first book, Educated, was a #1 New York Times bestseller and has remained on the list for more than a year. It was a finalist for a number of national awards, including 2 from the National Book Critics Circle Awards, as well as the Penn Gene Stein Book Award. President Barack Obama and Bill Gates both recommended Educated on their annual reading lists, and the American Booksellers Association named Educated the Adult Nonfiction Book of the Year. So, without further ado, please welcome Suleika Jaouad and Tara Westover to the stage.
Hi, Tara.
Hi, Suleika.
Hi, everyone. I love seeing this chat box and seeing some familiar names and so many new ones. This is so exciting.
It's very cheerful. I very much approve of the chat box. All right. Well, I guess we should get underway because, you have a lot of interesting things to tell us about. So, you have just written this book, Between Two Kingdoms. It came out 2 days ago. You're still standing. You're still with us. You're probably, I'm guessing, heavily caffeinated. But you're
just a little tired, but pretty excited to be here.
So you wrote this book, and I think my understanding was it followed from your column that you wrote for the New York Times, which was about being diagnosed with a very serious illness, leukemia, when you were 22. And I thought we just start at the beginning. So how did it start? When did you first notice that something might be wrong?
So in the summer of 2010, I had just graduated from college and I was kind of preparing to enter the real world, as people like to say in commencement speeches. And I had always loved to write, but I didn't really know how to even begin to think of that as a career. So I took a job as a paralegal and moved to Paris. And that's where I spent that first year out of college. I had these dreams of becoming a foreign correspondent, but, time felt infinite in the way that it does when you're 22 and you assume you have lots and lots of time to figure it out. But, I hadn't been feeling exactly like myself for a while. It started with this mysterious itch when I was in college. And during those months in Paris, I started to feel so exhausted that it was a struggle to walk up a flight of stairs, and my skin grew so pale it looked almost translucent. And I kept coming down with different colds and bouts of bronchitis. I went to see doctors and they sent me home. I was even hospitalized for a week and diagnosed with something called burnout syndrome.
I liked in your book, I remember you wrote a journal entry about that trip home, and you had written in it like WTF is burnout syndrome. Like that doesn't seem like a real thing.
Yeah, and I had this sense that something was wrong.
Did you ever? Because later you found out that you didn't just have leukemia; you had this thing called pre-leukemia. that if they diagnosed sooner, it would have made a huge difference. Were you ever, I don't know, were you ever resentful that they didn't pick up on those signs, that they took burnout syndrome seriously? Did you ever feel, I don't know, resurrecting that line, WTF is burnout syndrome? Like, why didn't you do tests? Did you feel like, I don't know, how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I don't blame the doctors that I saw. I definitely didn't feel like I was being taken seriously. But at the same time, I wasn't exactly taking myself seriously. I kind of explained away my fatigue as like the usual, 22-year-old's fatigue when you're burning both candles, at the ends. And I, started to have this bigger doubt as I was finding myself napping in utility closets at the law firm where I worked, that I somehow wasn't cut out for the adult world. And so the truth is, when I actually got my diagnosis, as devastated as I was and as terrifying as it was, I also felt this strange, perverse sense of relief. I finally had an explanation for my unraveling. I wasn't, making things up or a hypochondriac. And, it meant my fatigue was of me, not about me. And so in a strange way, I felt this kind of confusing mix of emotions of both terror and relief to just have an explanation.
Well, there was this really potent part of the book I remember where you were, I don't know if you were going up the stairs or down the stairs, but you were too tired to make it, and you kind of sat down, and you were resting, and you heard this conversation with your parents where they were describing the symptoms, and they basically said, it sounds like HIV. And so, which is totally understandable on their part, they're frightened and they're just trying to figure out what's wrong. But I was also just thinking how difficult for you to kind of hear that. And also probably you were already thinking that, what if I caused this? What if this is something that what if it's something that I did? And I just wondered, I don't know, was that part of the relief, I guess, that you finally, it was definitively not your fault?
Well, I think even when I got my diagnosis, that desire to understand why, to seek out an answer, to assign blame, is something that I think so many people in my situation find themselves in. And, one of the more harrowing moments after my diagnosis was when I met with my team of oncologists for the first time. And my mom said something like, she explained that she had brought me to her studio when I was a baby. She was a painter. And she said, is it possible that the exposure to the paint fumes caused this, that I caused this? And I think all of us, even when I got my diagnosis, were just trying to understand why this had happened, how it could have been prevented. And I think that yearning for control at a time when you have to cede so much of it is a natural impulse. It's obviously an unproductive one, but we were all doing that.
Yeah, I think that tendency to kind of, just blame yourself for things. A couple of people are upset that I had said, I didn't mean to imply that, if you have HIV, it's your fault. I think it's more that when things go wrong, I think we all have a tendency to kind of rack our brains and try to figure out and I think it's actually about control. You kind of think, if I can actually take blame for this, sometimes blame is more comfortable than accepting the reality that bad things happen. And that those bad things might be random. I think sometimes taking blame can actually feel better. It can be, as unpleasant as that is, it protects you from something even more unpleasant, which is that maybe you aren't responsible for it, and that means you don't have any control over it. You don't get to decide what happens to you. So I think that the sense of relief made a lot of sense, but was also really surprising. One of the other kind of sad and I found just surprising moments too was what happened when how you learned about some of the things that were going to come with the with the treatments, so especially like infertility. You mentioned like the doctors were understandably very panicked about just getting you into treatments, getting you into chemotherapy as an emergency. We have to but they kind of forgot to mention this huge thing. And you had to find out about it. Like what? I think you were just sitting up reading at 3:00 in the morning. Is how you found out.
Yeah. And, I just want to say one thing. I see this comment from Alice in the chat box who says, no illness is anyone's fault. And I think that's absolutely true, regardless of what your diagnosis is or the circumstances surrounding it. Yeah, I think that goes across the board. But yeah, so, I think like a lot of recently diagnosed patients, in addition to kind of yearning for control, I was also trying to wrap my head around this new diagnosis and wishing desperately that I had paid better attention in my high school science classes, because it was all so overwhelming. The medicalese, the information. And so I did what a lot of people do, which was I spent a couple of late nights going down a very dark WebMD black hole. And during one of those searches, I found out that the chemotherapy treatments I was scheduled to undergo the next day would leave me infertile. And, there were a couple things.
You found out the night before.
Yeah,
Wow.
There were a couple of things about that experience that struck me. I mean, the first was that up until that point, I hadn't given any thought to having children. In fact, the most thought I'd given to being a mother was specifically how not to become one before I was ready. But at the same time, I knew in that moment that I wanted to preserve that option for my future self. It felt like a kind of lifeline to an already uncertain future. It also felt like a breach of trust early on in that patient-doctor relationship. And it was a realization that no matter how brilliant and compassionate my medical team was, I was going to need to learn how to be an advocate for myself. And it was an important early lesson. It was, sort of stunning and horrifying as it was. It was a lesson that I needed to learn, and that came in handy much later on.
Yeah, and it seems like you, I think you kind of intuited something that is to say that the job of the people who are trying to keep you alive might be a tiny bit different from your job, which is not only just to stay alive, but preserve a future for yourself, And what I was kind of moved by that decision that you made to delay the treatments a little bit against their advice to preserve that option for yourself, it just struck me as something that you did to believe in a future that you were increasingly given no reason to believe in at all. And that was a very forward-thinking act to take.
In some ways, it was my last forward-thinking act. I think, when mortality hangs in the balance, our relationship to time changes. Time becomes a kind of waiting room, like a waiting room for appointments and test results, but also for better days. And there was this way in which, I stopped thinking about my past. My past was a reminder of everything that my life was no longer. And looking ahead felt very scary. My doctor, my doctors told me early on that I had about a 35% chance of survival. So I learned to be very present in a way that wasn't necessarily, some kind of like yogic choice, but it was what felt comfortable. And, the furthest I would think ahead was, the next biopsy, the next test result.
Yeah, I think just to shift gears a tiny bit, I think it's difficult to talk about healthcare or even illness in the United States without, I think, talking about finances and money. Mm-hmm. And I was reading today about how 65 or 66%, about 2/3 of bankruptcies in the United States are linked with medical problems, some kind of medical condition and medical bills. And I was just thinking, I was just thinking about this incredibly difficult thing that happened when you were ill, which is you were trying to make a decision about the future. You decided to get married. You were going to try to do this thing that was going to be this joyful decision that you'd made. And a social worker sat you down and said that you couldn't. And the reason that you couldn't get married was health insurance. You might lose your health insurance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was very fortunate to be on my dad's health insurance at the time because of the Affordable Care Act. And they were worried that getting married might jeopardize my ability to stay on his policy. But the question of money was so kind of omnipresent throughout and so tied to my ability to get healthcare. And I was very conscious of it right from the beginning. And, the cost of my treatment, both in dollars as well as in time, not just my own, but, my parents who were my caregivers, my partner at the time, and all the kind of copays ended up costing, a small fortune. And for us, luckily, that didn't mean that we had to, sell our homes, or that my parents had to get second jobs, although I know of a lot of patients who have had to consider those decisions. And the truth is that we have a lot of people in our country who are making impossible decisions between things like groceries and rent and life-saving medical treatment.
Yeah. I was just struck. Joyful thing that you could do, that in health insurance had to come into it. I don't know. It just seemed like a poignant moment that really encapsulated something wrong about the system. Okay, there's something else that this actually made me laugh, so we can talk about it. We can't get a whole lot of jokes when you're talking about a serious book, but as much as we can find some, I think we have to take them. So I was reading the section, I think it was pretty early on in your treatment that you escaped from the hospital room and you like hid your bracelet under the pillow and you took your IV pill and you snuck into the elevator. And then you said that you made it into the cafeteria and then you just suddenly were aware that the air was teeming with germs and you saw these people and you like ran back into the elevator. And I was reading it and when I read it, I just laughed out loud because I thought that is an experience that probably only a very small number of Americans had any knowledge of until recently. And now suddenly, every time anybody goes into a grocery store, like anywhere, we're all seeing all these germs in the air and we all see the air as something dangerous. But for you, you were seeing it that way when nobody else was, you were experiencing public places as unsafe, like long before anybody else was. And I don't know, I just thought there were so many things from your experience that I thought nobody experienced space this way except for people with compromised immune systems. And then the pandemic has universalized this one little piece of your experience.
Yeah. I love that. I hadn't thought about that particular moment in that way. But, for me, that first summer in the hospital, I spent about 6 weeks in a bubble in medical isolation. I wasn't allowed to leave. The windows wouldn't open. Anyone who came in had to be fully suited up in what looked like a beekeeper's uniform.
Right.
And
that's what my dentist looks like now, by the way. It's pretty much.
And I think many of us probably have had this experience during COVID of just this sort of maddening cabin fever that can creep in, where you're just so desperate to participate in the world and to be outside. And I felt that so intensely. I felt so achingly isolated, and I was just desperate to step outside of my bubble. And what that moment for me signaled when I, slipped off my hospital bracelet, got into the elevator with my IV pole, and found myself in this very crowded lobby, and just felt this wave of panic, was this realization that I was no longer comfortable in the outside world. Somehow, the walls of the hospital and my hospital room had become normalized to me. It was the outside world that had grown foreign and frightening to me. And it was such a strange shift among so many others.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit too about the effect that you experienced. I know this is a little bit of a difficult topic, but you've written about it so well. I think we better talk about it, which is the effect of the illness on your relationships. You were diagnosed. You had this new love, and in many ways, he was so supportive. He turned up for you in ways that were really kind of heroic in the way that you write about them. But you, I think, write really perceptively about the toll that took. Okay, what was I? Oh, yes, you wrote so well, I think, about the fact that I think you had this amazing sentence about how it admired the two of you and Amber in a way. Like, you were boyfriend and girlfriend, but you were also caretaker and patient, and that was just a certain kind of pressure that just built up over time. And I think some of the most moving parts of the book actually are where you write about the ways that you really needed this person, and it was distorting in some ways on the relationship in ways that were just really difficult to manage.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that was most important to me was to write an honest portrayal, not just of the imprints of illness on the body and on the spirit, but on family, on an entire community. Caregivers are so often sort of hidden in the shadows. And I was really interested in looking at the kind of relational experience of illness. And for me, having a romantic, having a relationship was so hugely crucial to my ability to endure that time. It made me feel wanted and young and even beautiful, even as, the person in the mirror kept changing. But at such a young age and such a new relationship, the pressures and the difficulties of illness really kind of eroded our ability to kind of see it through together. And I know, it's interesting. I've been hearing from people who are dealing with COVID and dealing with illness in this time of pandemic where we're all kind of stuck at home with one another, if we're lucky to have someone else sharing that space with us. And it's a lot of pressure on a relationship. And there's this way in which I think trauma or illness heightens all the good and all the bad. And it can also bring us down to our most savage self. And, I saw that in myself. I saw that in the people around me. And, as difficult as it was to relive those experiences in the writing, they felt so important to give ink to. Because there's also a way in which when someone's sick, everyone is trying so hard to be someone who suffers well, to put on a stoic facade, to be positive and brave for one another. And that's its own kind of pressurizing force.
Yeah. Well, and I think you wrote about how hard it was even once the illness finally went away, which for you took, what was the whole course for 3 or 4 years? I mean, it was a really long treatment. But even once you were cancer-free, you have the beautiful line in your book about that Will was gone, and this friend that you had made that was so important and passed away, and like Will was gone, Melissa was gone, the cancer was gone, and trying to reconcile with those three things and build some kind of life after was for you like really difficult to get to that next phase. You always thought, oh, well, if you can survive the cancer, then living will be easy, but that wasn't how you experienced it.
Yeah, it wasn't just difficult. I think it was surprising. For almost 1,500 days, I had been focused on one singular goal, which was to survive, and I hadn't really given much thought to what would happen after. And I think the hero's journey is one of our oldest story arcs, and it's one that's often projected onto people who have survived what was thought to be unsurvivable. And there's this expectation that when you emerge from something, say like cancer, you're going to be better and braver for what you've been through. You're going to have acquired all of this wisdom, and you're going to have this renewed zest for life. And so I, felt like I should feel excited and relieved and should feel a sense of return to the kingdom of the well. But I didn't feel that at all. In fact, I had never felt more lost. I very quickly realized I couldn't return to the person I'd been BC before cancer. And yet I had no idea who I was in the aftermath of this experience. I had no idea how to carry the wreckage of the past with me into the present. I had no idea how to find my way forward. And it was this really disorienting space to be in. It felt like a liminal space where on paper I was better, but off paper I couldn't have felt further from being the happy, healthy 27-year-old woman I'd hoped to be on the other side of all that.
Yeah, and part of the way you bridged that gap, you went on a trip. This is the first thing you did. You started on this really long trip to visit all the people who'd written to you, and you were writing, and then also writing was a big part, it seemed like, of how you started bridging that gap back into the world of the well.
So, yeah, I mean, I became really interested in rites of passage, these rituals and ceremonies that allow us to shoulder complicated feelings and to reflect on where we've been and to reflect on where we want to go, and that really help us cross the distance between no longer and not yet. And we have all kinds of rites of passage like this in our culture. We have weddings and funerals, we have sweet 16s and bar mitzvahs. But what I realized was that I didn't have any rituals or rites of passage. There were no discharge instructions or protocols to kind of help guide my way forward, and that I was going to have to invent one for myself. And so, before the road trip idea even blossomed, I knew a couple of things. I knew that I needed to learn how to be alone. After, being dependent on caregivers for so long, I needed to figure out how to become my own caregiver. I also needed to figure out how to navigate the world alone, and to really kind of break free from that small, isolated, confined space that I'd grown comfortable in. And I needed to kind of thrust myself into the greater expanses of the world. So I came up with this idea for a road trip. And what I also knew was that I needed guidance. I had so many unanswered questions, and I was really, yearning for, fellow denizens of the in-between place, people who had lived a reckoning, who had made it through their own aftermaths. And so I ended up making a list of about 22 people, many of whom had written me letters and really sustained me when I was sick, and also added a couple of people who had had a big impact on me during that time. And I set out on a 15,000-mile road trip across 33 states to see all of these people. But before I did any of that, I had to learn how to drive, which was like a small, very important detail.
Do please learn how to drive before driving for however many months. One of the parts of your book that I found really kind of funny and also like relatable, even if you've never had an illness like that, is when you described kind of steering your post-cancer body through dating. And I particularly just thought it was really funny when you described the first time you took your new boyfriend, you've got John, and you're taking him to this medical appointment because your life involved a lot of medical appointments. If he's going to be with you, he should know how that works. And and the doctor starts asking you about your stool samples and how they're going, if they're still the same as last time. And that feeling that you had of having to kind of hide things, or you had a port still in your chest, or you had scars. And I found it, especially the stool samples, was very funny, but I also thought very relatable in the sense that I think I think so many of us have this relationship with our bodies that we feel like we have to explain when we're with someone, like, oh, we need to explain the history of these things. Like, there's a reason why this is the way that it is. And I just thought, how much more intense is that after that kind of illness,
Yeah, I think, either we feel the need to explain or we feel the need to conceal our pasts. And for me, it was very much the latter. As I was kind of emerging from the fog of treatment and recently single and grieving so many things, my past relationship, my identity, friends that I'd made in treatment who had passed away, I had this sense that the way for me to heal was to move on from all of that, to like compartmentalize it and like put it in a box and just try as hard as I could to be a well person. And I kind of looked around to different friends of mine who were like in their 20s and tried to like actively think of like, what does a normal, healthy 26 or 27-year-old woman do? And like, I'm going to make a list of those things and I'm going to do those things. It was not at all an organic process. And when it came to dating, I was honestly terrified. And when I, entered into a new relationship with my now partner, John, I felt very much that I wanted to keep the medical as separate from him as possible. I would wait until he wasn't around to take my medications. I would hide my pill box. And I wanted so badly to be able to start over. And I didn't want any of that wreckage to kind of find its way into this new, beautiful relationship. But the bigger thing that I felt was a kind of armored heart. I think there's this way in which when you've endured loss, can make you guarded. It can make you not want to open yourself up to new loves and new losses. And that was its own kind of challenge. And to John's credit, not only was he here for all of the medical things, for, the questions of like, how many bowel movements are you having a day or whatever, and completely unfazed by all of it. But he also understood, without my having to explain, that I was in this very guarded place. And he gave me the space and the grace to unpack that for myself while also remaining present, even if that meant giving me the distance that I needed to go on this, 100-day road trip, and to figure those things out for myself.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to take a couple questions for a few minutes. And there's this nice, like, democratic system where people vote for them, which is fascinating. I'm so interested in this. So the one with the most votes, it's very democratic, is telling your journey sometimes triggering? Like, do you find, is it something that you would just like to put behind you and move forward, or do you find talking about it is helpful?
So interestingly, part one of my book, which is very much exists in the kingdom of the sick, was such a joy for me to write, because I felt comfortable in that world. And more than that, I got to hang out with many of the people in my life who are no longer alive. Max Ritvo, an incredible poet who I met when he was still in college in the pediatric cancer ward. My friend Melissa Carroll, who is an amazing painter. And it, for the duration of that part of the book, I got to hang out with my friends. I got to remember these like beautifully, darkly comic moments that we lived together. And the difficult part when it came to the writing was writing about the aftermath, because I was still very much living it. I didn't have distance. I was still uncertain about what it meant and how to kind of dilute that meaning onto the page. And I kept trying to write part two of the book in the past tense, and it wasn't working. It sounded false and kind of contrived. And it wasn't until I realized that I was allowed to switch tenses midway between the book that the recovery and that kind of aftermath experience was unlocked for me. And then the writing began to flow because I was living it. It was still very much unfolding in the present.
Yeah, it makes sense. We have one with 14 votes, which is the most votes. So we have some competitive voting happening here. The first question was asked by Alice. Thank you, Alice. The second question, Suzanne Lewis says, in an earlier interview, Suleika mentioned, someone asked a question that moved my thing. Suleika mentioned that to write a good book, one tells people things you don't want them to know about you. And to write a great book, one should write what you don't know about yourself. What did you discover that you didn't know about yourself?
It's such a good question. So I actually had those words on a Post-it note above my desk while I was working on the book. I discovered so many things about myself. I'm someone who, like, when I sit down to write a first draft, I find that my drafts are full of kind of aspirational lies, about like what I wish were true.
I don't know what an aspirational lie is, actually. That's a great phrase.
Like I wrote my most kind of composed, transformed self, and this is specific to Memoir. And then, in those subsequent drafts, I really try to kind of excavate the truth behind the truth behind the truth. And, I think some of the things that I discovered about myself weren't about myself at all. They were about the people around me. I remember asking my mom if she might be open to sharing her journals with me from that time, because I really wanted to understand her experience, and I wanted to write that caregiver perspective as accurately as possible. And I was so moved and heartbroken by what I found in those journals. And it really, gave me a deeper understanding of what it's like to sit in the caregiver's chair, what it's like to be a parent and to watch your child struggle or be hurt. And so, another thing I did was I worked with an amazing fact checker, Ben Phelan, and that also, who you also
He's my fact checker. No, he is.
You actually
good. He is.
And I know that fact checking a memoir isn't common practice, but I don't know about you, but I found it fascinating, and I think it made my book so much better. And it kind of gave me insight into certain details and to certain experiences that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And I was so surprised by what came up. There were some people who were mad that they were not in the book enough. It's
never what you think. It's never what you think. It's never what you think. No, I also like the fact check. I mean, it was really hard and really intense and really, I just keep saying that word intense. It was so intense. But I think for me, it was just validating because, I didn't trust my own perceptions of reality very much. And so it was really helpful to have someone come along that was just like, oh, don't worry, I'm going to look into it. I found it really freeing. So we have another question I think is really interesting from Joe Williams asks, how did your illness affect your spiritual journey?
It's such a good question. So I was raised by a father who, let me rephrase that. My father was raised Muslim. My mom was raised Catholic, and we would kind of practice those things when we were with their respective families. But when it came to just the two of them and me and my brother, we were raised in a fairly kind of secular household. And, my first kind of introduction to what role sort of faith or spirituality or religion might figure into illness was the presence of a hospital chaplain who would always appear at my hospital room door when I'd gotten some kind of awful medical news. And I don't know if this is just a coincidence, but I always dreaded his visits because I thought of him as like the spiritual Grim Reaper.
Nobody wants that title. That's not
no. And he was a lovely, lovely, lovely person, and I'm sure just wanted to offer comfort. But my first memory of prayer was on was in the bone marrow transplant ward, and it was on the eve of my transplant. And I kind of got out of bed and dragged my IV pole, and I had a little glow in the dark marker that someone had given me. And I wrote, 3 simple words on the wall before I kind of got down on my knees and made a prayer. And it wasn't really a prayer, it was more of a plea. And all it said was, let me live. And I think, some of the prayers that are made out of desperation are some of the most powerful ones. That was really kind of the beginning of, I don't even really know what to call it, but a sort of practice that I've continued, and that's brought me a lot of solace, especially in those more difficult passages.
So we have another question. Shannon Twenter wants to know, what was your favorite part of writing the book?
I loved writing about Oscar. My dog, my very, very badly behaved dog. People always think I'm joking when I say that.
He's not that bad. He's not that bad.
He's pretty bad.
He has bit me. However, now I'm reflecting. I'm like, I've been bit by Oscar. But
unfortunately, so on Tuesday for my launch day, I was in conversation with Elizabeth Gilbert, and she said the exact same thing, that she had been bit by your dog. So he's really getting quite a reputation. But he was such a source of joy for me when I was sick. He arrived in my life when I was recovering from my transplant, and we really grew up together. I love how wily he is. I love how unpredictable he is. So writing those passages about him, be it, as a puppy when I first rescued him, or like on the road in Montana when he was like chasing a chicken around and around a barn and finally caught it, much to the horror of my hosts, were some of the more fun moments.
Yeah. I got 2 questions here that I think kind of go together, so you can answer them however you like. One is from David Rumps and one is from Joan and Howard, and I'll just read them both. One is, what would you suggest for the college student or individual who's struggling to find their place in the world? And then below that is, do you feel that you've moved on from cancer, or at least put it on a shelf, or is it still a part of you?
Both such good questions. So I have been on a soapbox recently denouncing the pursuit of like following your passion. Because I think that's a lot of...
You don't want people following their passions?
I don't, because I think most of us, especially as recent college graduates, don't know what our passions are. Or we have like these preconceived ideas of what we're good at or what we think we should be doing that we conflate with passion. I would urge someone who's out of college to follow their curiosity. I think that very much applied to my younger self. I didn't give myself a lot of space to explore and to try new things. And I wish I had allowed myself that. And the second question is such a good one. No, I don't think I've moved on from cancer, because I don't know that we can move on from any of the hard things that we experience. I think one of my big realizations on my road trip was exactly that, and that instead of moving on, I had to learn how to move forward with my past and integrate it into the present. I had to learn to carry the imprints of illness, to carry that pain and to kind of welcome it, and to learn how to coexist with it.
Yeah. And then one of the ways you did that, of course, was writing. And so we have a writing question. Someone asked, what were the best resources on craft that you used and found game-changing?
That's such a good question. So I think, like you, had never like formally studied writing. And so when I sat down to write this book, I made a list probably of like 100, not just memoirs, but all kinds of books that I was looking to, and just read a lot and tried to like understand structure and tried to understand voice. And reading for me has always been the the best education, and not just, and reading widely. I think one of the things I so admired about your book, Tara, was the momentum and the pacing. And that was something I was thinking about a lot while I was working on this book. I was reading a lot of like true crime novels and murder mysteries, and really just trying to understand, like, what is narrative suspense? How do you sustain it, not just within a chapter, but like across, 300 something pages? Yeah. What about you? Can I ask you?
I mean, I read a lot of short stories. I got a little bit obsessed with the New Yorker fiction podcast. I got really into these weird grammar lectures about how to write long sentences and make them clear. I think for me it was short stories, and I wrote my whole book. Every chapter is a little bit like a short story, and that just helped me so much decide what to put in and what to put out, like leave out, because you have to make those kind of decisions when you write a short story. You have to organize things so that there's a theme, and there's another thing happening below the surface, and they interact with each other in interesting ways, and they pick at each other, the obvious story and the less obvious story. I didn't even understand that at all. I had no capacity for that. But when I read short stories, I thought, this is the way that I've experienced my life. There's always, it's almost like the conscious and the subconscious. It's like, here's the thing I think is happening to me, and then here's what's really happening to me. And I found that format as a way to do memoir was, for me, it just was so intuitive, and I hadn't seen that with memoir before, and I was just very drawn to it. So short stories for me. Because I'm moderating, I get to have the last question.
Okay.
So the democracy is now suddenly a dictatorship.
It's a pretty fun dictatorship.
So I saved this question for the end because I like it, which I guess I wrote it, so now I'm egomaniac. But reading your book, I was just really struck. We actually talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but I was so struck by everybody eagerly trying to claim blame. Just everybody was just you blamed yourself for your partying. Your mother said it must have been her fault because of she painted with you strapped to her chest, and it must have been the chemicals. There was a really touching moment where your brother said that because he was the donor, he felt responsible for the outcome of the transplant. Like, everybody was just trying to take blame. And I was reading recently Elaine Pagel's memoir that I think is just stunning, called Why Religion. And of course, she's a religion scholar at Princeton, but she also, like you, really struggled with loss. And for you, loss of that possible future, and a loss in your life changing. And for her, it was her son being born with a terminal illness. He died when he was 6, and her husband died shortly after that, just a freak accident. So she writes this beautiful book, and she has this quote I kind of wanted to share with you about that human instinct to assign blame, and I just wanted to get your reaction to it because it reminded me so much of what you wrote about. So she wrote, "Shaken by emotional storms, I realized that choosing to feel guilt, however painful, somehow seemed to offer reassurance that such events did not happen at random. During those dark, interminable days of Mark's illness, her son, I couldn't help imagining that somehow I'd caused it. If guilt is the price we pay for the illusion that we have some control over nature, many of us are willing to pay it. I was. To begin to release the weight of guilt, I had to let go of whatever illusion of control it pretended to offer, and acknowledge that pain and death are as natural as birth, woven inseparably into our human nature." And I just wondered if that resonated with your experience in terms of letting go of any illusion of control in order to free yourself of that kind of weight.
Yeah. I love Elaine Pagel's. I love her book, Why Religion. You had recommended it to me, I think, a year ago, and I've read it twice now, and I've thought about that quote a lot. And yes, what she's saying about letting go of control definitely resonates, and I would take it a step further, which for me, it wasn't just a question of letting go of control, but realizing what was within my control, which was the way that I made meaning of this experience. And I chose to do that through writing. But it really kind of allowed me to understand my circumstances on my own terms, in my own word. It gave me a way to make something artful and maybe even useful out of my predicament. And I think the kind of ability of creativity to alchemize pain is one of the most profoundly healing experiences, and kind of interesting and intricate experiences that we have that's within our control. And so for me, writing toward that blame, toward that guilt, understanding it, really kind of like examining it and turning it around almost as if, I was looking through a kaleidoscope, was the thing that allowed me to release myself from it.
Well, that I think is a beautiful place to end the evening. And Suleika, thank you so much for letting me interview you. And thank you to everybody for coming. We'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Clara.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Suleika, for joining us tonight. And thank you, our wonderful audience, for joining us as well. If you haven't already purchased your copy of Between Two Kingdoms, there's a purchase button at the bottom of your screen. There's no excuse to not buy it because it's right there. Is there anything last you both would like to say to our audience before we sign off for the night?
I just want to say a big, big thank you to everyone who joined. I've seen people joining from all over the country, from Bali, from France, which means it must be very late where you are. So thank you for staying up late and for hanging out with us. And a big thank you to you, Tara. I saw a question about how we became friends, which we'll answer another time. But I'm so grateful to you, and I'm so grateful to the Strand.
Yeah. No, just thank you for having me, and everybody enjoy Suleika's book. This beautiful book.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And stay safe out there and have a good rest of your night.